Welcome to another edition of Living with Purpose. Today I have this extraordinary person, Bridgette Stumpf, who I'm actually meeting for the first time. She runs an organization called Volare, where she is really working with restoring people that have been trauma impacted and trauma impacted communities. I was introduced to her by my daughter-in-law because she is doing some workshops for her organization. And my daughter-in-law texted me and said, this is this person that you must talk to and meet. And she said she's run this workshop and there is not a single senior executive that has not paid full attention to it. And the work that she's doing is awesome. So, Bridgette, welcome to Living with Purpose.
Oh my gosh, what an honor to be here. Your work, Dr. Bridgette, has really informed how I think about building resilient teams and people. So it's just such an exciting moment for me, and I really appreciate you having me.
So Bridgette, talk a little bit about your journey. Where were you born, your family, and how did you eventually come into this space?
I grew up in a really small rural town in Idaho. And I really had this unique experience of graduating from a high school class that was less than 30 people. And where I stand now, I'm the first person in my family to ever graduate from college. Eventually, I went to law school, and that was all completely self-funded. And the backdrop to this kind of early childhood is that I noticed my parents had this entrepreneurial spirit, this hustle that they were always working towards. And without even noticing it at the time, I was really living and knowing resource scarcity. And the same entrepreneurial spirit that my parents used to navigate that kind of developed in me early on. And I think it's become part of the ethos of who I am. And this is kind of layered with the experience that I had a really disengaged biological father and ultimately was adopted by my stepdad at the age of 8. And these two things culminated and really shaped how I view myself in the world. And it come to sort of create this understanding in me that deprivation has this double-edged sword, right? To know and survive trauma and scarcity means that we have these kind of deep wounds that we carry with us throughout life. But the kind of positive side to that is sometimes it also sharpens something in us. And I think of this kind of sharp tool as my resiliency that is the product of these experiences.
You know, the word that you use, which I've not heard used too many times, is deprivation. And the flip side of deprivation, which allows you to actually become resilient. And that to me is just a very interesting way of thinking, because all of us go through some sense of deprivation, whatever it may be. Our scales of deprivation differ. People who are extremely wealthy also feel deprived of certain things. But how do you balance that? But before we talk a little bit about that and the work that you're doing, I want to kind of go back into your community. Were your parents, your stepdad, farmers or working in a small community? Just talk a little bit about what were they doing and then decide to go into law.
I'm laughing at this question because I'm thinking, well, how much time do you have? Because part of being an entrepreneur is you learn to sort of do all things, right? You become a jack or Jill of many trades. And if you were to go back to the town that I grew up in and ask the people who have known me my whole life that still live there or friends that I grew up with at the same time, they will tell you stories of how they saw me on the weekends working on a roof with my dad. That was a job he was working on. He worked at kind of the local hardware store in the 9 to 5 hours, but had his own business. I think it's a lost art, but it's essentially putting the insulation that you see in between log homes. We call this chinking. That's like an art where you sort of take a trowel and smooth it out. And if it's not for art, I think then people think about it in terms of functionality for construction. But I grew up sort of doing this art on log homes my entire life, spending my evenings, my weekends, working with my dad on the side business. My mom owned a local floral shop. So I had this other kind of creative side of my brain where I was helping with corsages and boutonnieres, at all the high school dances and helping with people that I knew and sort of being a part of how we celebrated their life through this business that my mom had. There was a time in my life where my dad was a rancher, and I grew up kind of watching the baby calves when they were born. It was very cold in Idaho, and you had to monitor the time of their birth, and you would actually bring them into the barn. And there are stories of me falling asleep with these brand new baby cows, feeding them and keeping them warm. And I almost think now as an adult, seeing how my kids are growing up, on the East Coast, had this weirdly idyllic childhood in the sense of freedom and growth that I experienced because of the way of life. And it was coupled with the reality that it was a lot of deprivation that I didn't necessarily recognize or even notice at the time until I had the ability to see what life looks like with more resources. And that's kind of the world I have right now as an adult that feels very different than that childhood.
And again, let me just pick a little bit that you just said, right? One can see work as work, or one can find art in the work that you're doing. The simple act of traveling, putting cement between layers of log, can be mundane, or it can be art. A flower shop obviously is a visual and sensory piece of environment, and how different people actually use flowers to mark different occasions. And that in itself tells the journey of a person's life. So this ability for you to actually engage with all of that, and then animals and green birds, my God, what an amazing childhood you had. So here you're growing up in this interesting environment, maybe not idyllic, but at least a environment in which you are thriving and coping at the same time. How did you then decide that law is what you wanted to pursue?
I had a fairly, I would call it non-traditional path to law school. I grew up always wanting to be a journalist. And I don't know if it's because that was such a window for me to see how big the world really was when I lived in kind of this tiny, small place. And I really saw journalism as this form of advocacy. I really think I came out of the womb just feeling this deep sense of need to fight injustice. It's just been a part of my North Star since I can remember being on this planet. And I found in, really my narrative of the stories I told myself that journalism was a way to advocate for people, that it was a way to bring truth and light to injustice and give people tools to sort of combat those injustices. So I ended up going to a local community college, partially because I needed my school to be paid for. That was not something my parents were going to be able to help me with. And I knew this was sort of the path I wanted to take. And then I got a scholarship to come to a college in Maryland where I graduated with a communications degree. And I started working at the local daily paper, writing stories as we do about small kind of towns. I was working on a story that changed my entire view of really journalism, but also what I could do with it. I was essentially following 10 people who had been displaced when their car broke down in this county I was working at. And there was this local law that required the county government to pay money for people who become displaced. So fixing the car so they could continue on their journey. And there was, I would say, question about whether or not the government actually did what the law required. And so I'm trying to work with two parents who have 8 children and, are now homeless and have very little resources to help center how they're being impacted by this experience. And I realized that I can't truly advocate for the people most impacted by the story that I was telling without understanding the law. I just was at a disadvantage. And so I went to law school, and this is what's so funny, not to be a lawyer. I actually went to law school to be a better journalist. My first day, I remember it so clearly in contracts, the professor says, "Who here doesn't want to be a lawyer?" And I didn't realize he was kind of asking this in jest to no one puts themselves through law school not wanting to be a lawyer. And I got to raise my hand. And it just is such a symbolic moment for me now of how non-traditional my experience was and how aloof I was to the fact that people just didn't go to law school to be better at their job.
So you go through law school, and clearly you decided that you didn't want to pursue journalism, or you did for a little while, and then decided that there was a whole new space that you wanted to be in. So talk a little bit about that. And again, just before you do that, for our listeners, just because you get a training in a particular field doesn't necessarily mean you operate in that field. This notion that I can actually become a better journalist by just understanding law better is a very fascinating thought process in terms of how your careers can be shaped by different aspects of knowledge that you gain. So let's come back to you and talk about how did that then evolve into the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, Dr. Bashar, this is so interesting because I almost think, and I've never connected the dots until you just said this out loud, but my journey into where I am now in my career was shaped by this belief that I have that my sense of purpose is always evolving, right? It's always changing. And in fact, it's not something we discover. It's actually something that we seek, that we pursue. And it was my pursuit of knowledge, of learning, that sort of put me up this new purpose in my life, which now today, I often tell people I'm a retired journalist, gone crime victims' rights lawyer that had the opportunity for trauma education. And it changed me not only as a lawyer, but now as a leader, where I lead an organization called Volare that you mentioned, a nonprofit rooted in the District of Columbia that is directly investing in how we can build ecosystems of restoration and healing, both by offering kind of direct services for crime victims, but also providing this really novel cross-sector education for leaders. And it's really driving home this idea that when we create trauma-informed organizations, we have more resilient teams, we have stronger community fabric. And I'm so lucky to be able to do that work now that I didn't predict at all going into law school. And the entire sort of impetus of getting there was that I needed a job during law school that paid me. And this was such an unusual thing to find. So many kind of 1L law students, they're looking for an internship that's going to set their career up, or an externship that's going to kind of give them a foot in the door at wherever they want to go in their career. And I just needed something that was actually going to pay me because I was taking care of myself, right? And still sort of leaning into this need to access education without the same resources that many of my classmates had. And so I stumbled into a scholarship program called Students for Public Interest. It still exists at my law school. And they would actually pay you to do an internship at a local nonprofit. And I fell into doing work at one of our local crime victims' rights clinics. And I never looked back. I graduated law school a semester early. When I was sworn in, I was already working on cases that I was a part of, having been at this organization since first year of law school. And it sparked this passion in me that was honestly connected to journalism. I viewed my work as a crime victims' rights lawyer to hold the system accountable to the people that it is now saying it's there to serve, who've experienced harm from crime. And I see that so closely connected to being a conduit of the truth, right? What is journalism about? And my shift to being the survivors' rights lawyer was about making sure that people's truth was centered in these systems and processes that are often not designed to think about the people that are impacted by them.
So talk a little bit about the kind of people you work with.
I think one of the most important ways to answer that question is just acknowledging that so many people are impacted by trauma, not always trauma related to crime, but when we think about what trauma really is, kind of reframing our understanding, it's anything that's threatening, dangerous, out of our control. So things like poverty, racism, right? When you think about all the experiences one may have in our society based on their identity and their lived experience, so many people know that feeling. And so I just happen to be at sort of the smaller subset of trauma survivors that have had this horribly, often the most tragic experience of their life related to someone else causing them harm. And I think when you ask who we serve, it's really important to be clear that we support people who've experienced harm from crime. But I recognize and know that the root causes of violence are truly from underinvested communities, unaddressed traumas. And if we actually got to those root causes of how does trauma go so unaddressed and what are the consequences of that in our society, I think my work is actually about serving everyone in the community, even though the sort of surface is really just kind of focused on the people who experience trauma related to crime.
The important message is the importance of communities, that we are losing what has always been an anchor for humankind.
Yeah.
Which is communities that became your foundation in where you grew in. Community could be 10 people, it could be 100 people, it could be 20 people. And today we are becoming less and less dependent on that community, which is physical. And in some ways, we are venturing into these online communities that then carry with it the additional danger of additional harm. And in some ways, the work that you are doing is really trying to bring back in the building of these communities. So I find that to be very fascinating. So again, just on this notion, what are some of the outcomes of the work that you do?
There's, of course, the numbers. We serve about 1,200 individual people a year. And from an output perspective, we're measuring what type of service did that person get? Was it access to free lawyers so they can maintain ongoing access to safe education? Was it being able to, honestly, some of the most basic needs? One of the stories that sticks with me so deeply is a survivor of gun violence. And she was so afraid to leave her home that she couldn't leave to buy diapers for her newborn baby. And we actually sent her diapers. When you think about the experience of dignity and what it means to survive trauma, just by having a support system that's going to take care of your daily needs, how simple yet profound that is. We're touching 1,200 people's lives a year. But from an outcomes perspective, and this is why it's so hard to fund, right? When we think about what funders want to see in sort of these long-term outcomes of our work, we don't truly have a sense to measure what are the benefits, what is the sort of human, social, and financial cost that we save when we invest in trauma and its consequences on the front end as opposed to the back end. And what I mean by this is when you have a survivor of, let's say, sexual violence, maybe someone who's particularly younger folks are vulnerable to this, and they're maybe in college trying to navigate their education. That individual, after that experience, does not have a support system to help them move through that experience of pain. The unaddressed consequences of that are often they drop out of school. They can't show up fully in their families. If they're already a caregiver or have a family, they can't show up fully for their children. They certainly can't show up fully at their employers. That costs something for that employer when they lose good talent. And ultimately, the unaddressed consequences of trauma are that we all pay the cost of that burden. And so from an outcomes perspective, I believe that the work we do, while it directly touches 1,200 people a year, is actually more about strengthening communities, because when that person gets that wraparound support, those consequences that touch us all when they don't are far minimized. Hard to measure the true outcomes, but I think ultimately it's about recognizing this connection between unaddressed trauma and the sort of what we think about as the isolation and disconnection epidemic that we have in our country.
We can keep having a very long conversation on these issues, but let me just turn to what you just talked about, purpose, and why, in your own words, purpose is important to you. And you also kind of talked about it, that it said purpose is not something that you just articulate. Purpose is something that you discover. And one of my previous guests actually talked about that purpose is part of your memory, and it slowly starts coming out as you build your journey. And it's the ability to be attuned to it, because we are all born with a purpose.
Yeah.
It's embedded in you. So talk a little bit about, Bridgette, how you think about purpose and why purpose is important for you, given the work that you do.
I love thinking about this. I've always thought about purpose, even as a young child. And I think I probably think about it even more as an adult that's raising my own kids. But I think purpose is something that is not discovered. We don't stumble on it. But in fact, I actually believe purpose is something that we curate. And there's a reason that I think about it in this way. it's so deeply tied to my work and some of the trauma-informed principles that we use to think about how might we empower someone, give them agency and choice when they've experienced harm from trauma. And I think what I've come to realize is that when we can see that our story, the mark we're going to leave in this world, that we have control over that, all of a sudden this idea that we can seek and build our own purpose becomes much more attainable. And it's about something we control. This idea of agency and choice and what our purpose is, how we live it, is so deeply connected to what I know to be true when supporting survivors of trauma, is that giving someone agency and choice is one of the most beautiful, supportive things that you can do.
Fascinating word, right? Curating. How do you curate something? And through the journey of curation, you actually develop agency. And what does agency then mean to you? And it actually gives you the permission to show up your authentic self.
Yeah.
And so purpose is kind of the underlying driver to that. So it's such a fabulous way in which you frame this. So let's end with your sharing with us your one golden nugget, a piece of wisdom that you want to leave our listeners with.
Well, as you can tell, I love to talk about this. So, of course, in reflecting on what my golden nugget is, I came up with a bit of an analogy that I wanted to share with you and the listeners. This analogy is all framed around this concept that I believe purpose seeking is a necessary pillar that supports our personal resiliency. And so imagine that we live in this shelter, and the shelter is our resilience. It protects us from the storms of life, shielding our body, our mind, our spirit when these storms kind of come at us. And we are able to hold up this protective shelter, this roof, because we have these strong pillars that support the structure, and they have to be strong enough to bear the weight of, grief, loss, uncertainty. And one of those pillars that we need to support our resiliency is purpose. And there are others, giving mindset, gratitude. But unlike a column that's kind of a rock, it's just sort of solid in there, our purpose pillar is actually living. I think about it like a tree. It's kind of rooted in the deepest values that shape how we view the world, but it's also constantly growing and changing as we move through life. And when suffering comes, because as you've said, we know it will, to be human is to know suffering, the winds shake this pillar and they put strain on this trunk. And we know that if it was too rigid, it would crack and it would break, but because it's living, it's kind of this stretchy, bendy, strong oak. And I think this is such an important way of thinking about purpose, because when we know that it can be curated, to curate purpose means both to create it and to care for it, right? We have to care for this pillar. That means pruning the things that are no longer true, the things we don't need, maybe even feeding it with things we learned, community, meaning making. And of course, we have to allow it to evolve as we deepen our own understanding in life. And for me, the golden nugget is that purpose isn't found. It's curated. And if we stay focused on this truth, one of the most powerful things we can do is understanding that this is what allows us to build a resilient life.
There's so much deep thoughts that have just been shared that I just want to thank you very much and end at this note that purpose is curated. It is also your shelter that allows you to build resiliency and provides you with a safe space. Bridgette, thank you so very much for being part of this podcast and our journey of living with purpose. Again, purpose is that renewable source of energy that continues to drive humanity forward. Curate your own purpose. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.